So far in James's essay, we have swung from the too extreme and external standpoint of Chautauqua, right? All of the trappings that made it seem like paradise and all you'd need for a significant life. And we've swung now to the too exclusively internal, over romanticized view of struggle in the view of the poor, the working classes. So the question then becomes, how do we recover our balance between the internal and the external perspective? One thing we can do is we can remember the principle, which is respect other people's ways of being happy as long as those ways don't interfere with your own. It's too easy to make a target out of others, right? It's too easy to make a scapegoat or a target out of the artist or the intellectual or the garbage collector. In each of them, there may be something unique and something struggling. Not everything can be turned into a class struggle or an intellectual paradise. Right? So when we forget this principle of tolerance, we forget that it's fruitless to tell someone who's upset over something, let's say they're upset about a test grade or a parking ticket, that they should be glad they don't have bigger problems. To the person with a problem, it is a big thing to them. And discrediting the context in which they feel things ignores the reality of their point of view. They have a real point of view. It is real. It feels real to them. So keep a balance is sort of the point here. So if we try to keep a balance between both the inner and the outer, the internal and the external perspectives, to understand what makes a life significant, we have to remember that it's more than just inner dignity at stake, and it's more than just external trappings or achievements that are important of life. We care about what people think of what we do because what we do matters. So a moment ago, we saw James rethink Tolstoy's praise of the peasant workers, the mass of humans, and we saw that it went too far for James because it romanticizes their lives. Right? So now we get to move to a third factor, which James has been leading to, but which he hasn't yet mentioned, and that is the factor of ideals and imagination. What's an ideal for James? Do you remember? Well, for James, ideals are models and plans and standards. Right? Ideals are models and plans and standards. More important, I think, is that ideals make our inner life complete and meaningful. An ideal is not just a wish, though. This is crucial. An ideal has to be three things. An ideal has to be conscious, it has to be novel, and it has to be acted upon. An ideal can serve to unify action and give direction to one's life, but it has to be conscious, novel, and acted upon. So let's think about that the idea, an ideal which someone just has in mind, right? Let's imagine that you have an ideal of stopping the development of a park into a shopping mall. Right? Let's say that's your ideal. You also have to have a second factor, will, in the form of virtues, right? You have to be able to make this happen, this ideal happen. You can't just have it in mind as a dream. You have to make it happen. So you need to have certain virtues in your character. You need to have the tenacity to fight the problem over the long haul. You have to have the courage to stand up to people who might be older or wealthier or more powerful than you. You have to have the fair-mindedness, right, to see what's at stake from the other side. And you need to have the common sense to act swiftly. So there's an interdependency here that applies, and it also applies to will and virtue. So it applies to the ideal, it also applies to the will and the virtues, right? So it's not enough to just have virtues like courage and tenacity, because what good is courage if you don't have ideals to guide that courage? So think about it this way. Virtues without ideals are blind. Virtues without ideals are blind. You might have the power to act, but for what? What should you use that right virtue for? Ideals without virtues are impotent. Right? You might have a clear aim, but a weak will. Right? Without both, you cannot make progress. Now, we've been thinking and talking very abstractly about ideals for a moment. Try to think about some ideals that you have. What are some examples of ideals? What different kinds of ideals are there? Think about that for a moment. I mean, some kinds of ideals that we have are self interested and some are altruistic, right? You might want to become a great painter. You might want to help the elderly. You might want to be less lonely and less isolated, right? So you could have an ideal of becoming a less lonely person or a great painter or someone who helps the elderly. These are all ideals. You might have ideals that are short range. You might have ideals that are long range, right? A short range ideal might be, I'm going to finish my education. A long range ideal might be something like, I'm going to help stop global warming or climate change. Another ideal might be that you're aiming for physical change or that you're aiming for mental change, right? You might want to control urban sprawl. You might want to make poetry popular. You might want to lower your heart rate, right? So there are all kinds of ideals. You could have ideals at a local level, at a regional level, at a national level, at a global level. So you get my point, right? Ideals can range quite widely. But ideals, whatever they are, without action are, James says, contemptible. Right? Think about someone, imagine if it was said of you, right? He had big ideals, but he never did anything about them. Or, well, she talked a lot about compassion, but she never gave anyone a dime. She never helped anyone but herself. Right? So ideals without action are not significant. In fact, they're the opposite. They're contemptible. So how do all these factors add up? So you might put this in a phrase for James by saying these ideals add up in the following way. What makes a life significant adds up in the following way for James. Cultivate ideals intelligently and act on them. Seems okay, right? So he's saying that we get a significant life by cultivating our ideals, and education can be a big help in cultivating ideals. It's hard to have a range of interesting and novel ideals without knowing something about the world. Acting on them, right? So cultivating your ideas with education, with imagination, and then acting on them. And so different people, regardless of who they are not intrinsically heroic or intrinsically despotic. Everyone has to learn how to respect other people, as long as none of them are the cause of others' misery. Right? And the same is true of people from different genders, races, backgrounds, and so forth. So living of a meaningful life for William James is the product of one's inner ideals and what they put into practice, and not the circumstances of their background. So that's the end of this short lecture on William James, What Makes a Life Significant. I hope it's been helpful for you, and I look forward to talking to you very soon.